March 17th, 1943. 0428 hours. Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay, Oahu. The pre-dawn air hung thick and warm over the Pacific, carrying the smell of salt and aviation fuel. Lieutenant Commander James Harrell stood on the concrete ramp watching his crew file toward the massive Consolidated PBY-5A Catalina designated Cat 7. The flying boat sat half submerged in the calm water, its parasol wing invisible in the darkness, hull reflecting the few lights that hadn't been blacked out. Behind him, aviation machinist's mate, Second Class Robert Mackenzie, hefted his sea bag through the waist hatch. Inside that bag, 3 changes of underwear, a razor, his letters from home, and enough personal effects for what the operations officer had clinically described as an extended maritime patrol. Extended. The Navy had a gift for understatement. They would be airborne for 31 hours. 31 hours in a machine that was part airplane, part ship, part floating barracks. 31 hours over an ocean so vast that entire fleets could disappear into its emptiness. At 0445, the twin Pratt and Whitney R1830 engines coughed, backfired, then roared to life with a sound like continuous thunder. 2,400 horsepower shaking the hull, sending vibrations through the water that could be felt 100 yards away. Harrell advanced the throttles. The Catalina began its takeoff run, hull slamming against the swells, throwing spray across the windscreen until that singular moment when water released its grip and the aircraft climbed into darkness. Behind them, the lights of Hawaii disappeared. Ahead lay 3 million square miles of ocean and an enemy that hunted beneath the waves. What Harrell and his crew didn't know, what none of the patrol squadrons scattered across this Pacific could have known, was that they were fighting the longest battles of the war in the most unusual weapon system ever created. Not a bomber, not a fighter, something unprecedented. An aircraft with bunks for sleeping, a galley for cooking, and a toilet. An aircraft designed not for speed or firepower, but for something far more demanding. Endurance, the ability to remain airborne across spans of time that exceeded human capacity for sustained attention, that tested the limits of mechanical reliability, that required men to eat, sleep, and fight while suspended between sky and ocean for longer than most bomber crews spent in an entire week of missions. This is the story of how America built a flying ship and asked ordinary men to live inside it for days at a time, hunting an invisible enemy across an incomprehensible vastness. The Japanese had been certain of one thing when they struck Pearl Harbor. The Pacific was theirs. Its distances were their greatest defense, its emptiness their shield. American carrier groups could strike, but they couldn't maintain presence. American submarines could hunt, but they operated blind, relying on chance encounters in waters where the odds of finding an enemy ship approached lottery-level improbability. An American patrol aircraft, those few lumbering PBY Catalinas stationed at scattered bases, had neither the range nor the endurance to threaten Japanese control of the vast ocean. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. The Pacific Ocean covered 63 million square miles. A surfaced submarine presented a target perhaps 300 feet long and 30 feet wide. Finding one without knowing its location was like searching for a single grain of sand on a beach the size of Asia. And submarines, unlike surface ships, could dive, disappearing into 3-dimensional space where visual detection became impossible. The Americans, the Japanese command calculated, would exhaust themselves searching empty water, while Japanese submarines ranged freely, cutting supply lines, isolating Australia, starving the Allied island bases into submission. What Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence had failed to understand was that American engineers had approached the problem differently. They hadn't tried to make patrol aircraft faster or more numerous. They had made them capable of staying airborne longer than seemed humanly possible, and in that endurance lay a weapon the Japanese had never anticipated. The story began not with Pearl Harbor, but in October 1933, when the United States Navy issued a specification that seemed almost fantastical. They wanted a flying boat capable of remaining airborne for 24 hours or more, carrying a 2,000-pound bomb load, cruising at 100 miles per hour, and possessing enough range to patrol 1,000 miles from base and return. These numbers were absurd, No aircraft in service anywhere in the world could achieve such performance. But the Navy had recognised something that would prove prophetic. In the coming war, whoever could watch the longest would control the ocean. Consolidated Aircraft Corporation accepted the challenge. Chief designer Isaac Macklin Laddon understood immediately that achieving extreme endurance required solving a problem no one had seriously addressed. The crew would become the limiting factor. Men could not maintain alertness or operational effectiveness for 24 hours without rest, food, and basic sanitation. The aircraft would need to become a flying habitat. The XP-3Y1 that first flew on March 21st, 1935 from Hampton Roads, Virginia was unlike anything that had taken to the air before. Its deep hull provided not just buoyancy but internal volume. The high parasol wing, supported by streamlined pylons, cleared the engines well above the water spray. Most revolutionary was the interior. Laddon had designed crew facilities into the aircraft itself. A small galley with an electric hot plate, a chemical toilet, crude but functional, canvas bunks that folded down from the hull walls, enough internal volume that men could move about, change positions, relieve each other at stations. The PBY Catalina was not just an airplane, it was a flying barracks where men could work and live for longer than the human body was designed to endure continuous operation. Production began in 1936. The Navy ordered 60 aircraft that June. By December 1941, over 600 were in service. The type would ultimately become the most produced flying boat in history, with approximately 3,300 built. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, they destroyed battleships and fighters, but scattered across the Pacific were dozens of Catalinas. Ugly and slow and utterly unsuited for the kind of warfare the Japanese expected. What the Japanese didn't understand was that these aircraft would wage a different kind of war, a war measured not in minutes but in days. Step inside a PBY Catalina and you entered a world that defied conventional understanding of what an aircraft could be. The hull, 63 feet long with a 16-foot beam at its widest, contained everything needed to sustain human life at altitude for 30 hours or more. Every cubic foot served multiple purposes, engineering efficiency born of absolute necessity. Through the waste blister hatch, you found yourself in the central operations compartment. To starboard, the radio operator's station, surrounded by equipment that would have filled a room in a ground station, all miniaturized and shock-mounted for flight. Multiple receivers and transmitters capable of communicating across thousands of miles. The radioman worked in a nest of vacuum tubes, condensers, and coils that required constant adjustment. Atmospheric conditions degraded signals. Tubes failed. Connections worked loose. The equipment was temperamental, power-hungry, and absolutely essential. Without it, the aircraft became isolated, cut off from any possibility of rescue if things went wrong. Directly after sat the galley. To call it a galley was generous. A single-burner electric hot plate. Several insulated containers for coffee and soup. Storage lockers containing sea rations, canned goods, bread, whatever fresh food could be loaded before departure. No refrigeration. The food situation was basic but revolutionary. Hot food and drink maintained morale and provided energy during missions that stretched across multiple meal cycles. Men heated canned stew, brewed coffee that grew progressively more bitter as the hours wore on, made sandwiches from bread that dried and curled in the thin air. After 20 hours aloft, everything tasted like cardboard. But the ability to eat at all, to have hot coffee at 2 a.m. during hour 18 of a patrol, made the difference between men who could function and men who collapsed from exhaustion. The toilet, located aft of the galley in a small compartment, was crude but essential. A chemical toilet similar to those used in early trains and aircraft, requiring careful maintenance and creating an odour that became legendary among Catalina crews. Men joked that you could navigate to a PBY in the dark just by following your nose. But this single amenity made extended missions survivable. Bomber crews over Europe used relief tubes. Fighter pilots had bottles. Patrol plane crews had an actual toilet. In a 31-hour mission, this wasn't luxury. It was operational necessity. The crew rest area featured canvas bunks along both sides of the hull in the waist section. 4 to 6 narrow cots, depending on configuration, positioned where every vibration from the engines transmitted through the structure. Sleeping on them while the aircraft flew was like trying to sleep on a running diesel locomotive. The noise was relentless, the vibration constant, yet exhausted men could and did sleep there, catching precious hours of rest during the long watches. The unwritten rule was absolute. If a man was in a bunk, he was off duty. No one disturbed a sleeping crewman except in emergency. Sleep rotation was not suggested. It was mandatory. After 20 hours of continuous operation, crew efficiency degraded catastrophically without rest. Forward, the flight deck accommodated pilot and co-pilot on elevated seats with excellent visibility through the greenhouse-style canopy. The navigator's station occupied the nose compartment, equipped with a drift sight, octant for celestial navigation, and plotting table. At night, the navigator worked by the light of a small red lamp, shooting star sights through a hatch in the roof, exposed to screaming wind and temperatures that could drop below freezing even over the tropics. His mathematics determined whether the aircraft would find its way home or become lost in the immensity, circling until fuel exhausted and the ocean rose up to claim them. The bomb bay in the centre hull could carry 4,000 pounds of ordnance, depth charges, bombs, torpedoes, hanging on racks accessible through hatches in the hull. Arming these weapons required a man to squeeze into the confined space, a dangerous job when the aircraft pitched and rolled in turbulent weather. The ordnance man worked in darkness, feeling more than seeing, his hands following practice movements to set fuses and arm explosives that could detonate if improperly handled. This was the machine that would fight the longest missions of the war. The statistics told one story: 104-foot wingspan, 1,750 gallons of internal fuel, 2 R1830 twin Wasp engines producing 1,200 horsepower each, maximum speed 196 miles per hour, typical cruise 115 miles per hour. But the real capability could not be expressed in numbers. It was in what the aircraft allowed men to do, to remain on station watching empty ocean for 20 hours, for 25 hours, for 30 hours, maintaining vigilance when vigilance seemed pointless, staying alert when exhaustion demanded sleep, hunting an enemy that might never appear across distances that defeated human comprehension. A typical Catalina patrol crew consisted of 7 to 10 men, each a specialist whose skills overlapped as the mission progressed. The patrol plane commander, usually a lieutenant or lieutenant commander, bore ultimate responsibility. He was pilot, tactician, administrator, counsellor. His decisions determined success or failure, life or death. The best commanders were older officers with thousands of flight hours, men who understood both the capabilities and limitations of their aircraft and their crew. They knew when to press an attack and when survival demanded retreat. The co-pilot flew during routine phases, allowing the commander to rest, navigate, or manage tactical situations. On 31-hour patrols, the two pilots alternated 4-hour shifts, though both remained in the cockpit during critical phases. The autopilot, when it worked, provided some relief, but flying a patrol plane was never truly hands-off. Wind, weather, and the constant need for course corrections demanded attention. The navigator was arguably the most critical specialist. In an era before GPS, when radio navigation aids were limited and unreliable, he used celestial observations, dead reckoning, and LORAN, when available, to determine position. A skilled navigator could guide his aircraft to a rendezvous point after 15 hours of flight. A poor navigator could get his crew hopelessly lost with fuel exhausted and no land in sight. The best navigators were mathematicians and artists simultaneously, blending precise calculation with intuitive feel for wind and drift. The radio man maintained contact with base, with other aircraft, with surface vessels. His equipment required constant nursing. During radio silence, when operating in enemy waters, he still listened, monitoring for distress calls or enemy transmissions. The flight engineer monitored engine performance, fuel consumption, and aircraft systems. He could diagnose problems by sound and vibration, adjust mixture and RPM to maximize range, often repair failures in flight. His fuel calculations determined whether they reached base or ditched at sea. The ordnance man prepared and released weapons. The gunners manned waist positions and bow turret, scanning for enemy aircraft and submarines. In the early Pacific War, before long-range fighter escorts, the gunners were the crew's primary defence. Their vigilance determined survival. Between these specialists flowed a rotation system that kept the aircraft functioning across time spans that defeated normal human endurance. Men not actively on duty attempted sleep, prepared food, or simply rested. On truly extended patrols, lasting more than 24 hours, crew efficiency degraded severely without sleep rotation. Fatigue impaired judgment, slowed reactions, increased accident risk. The bunks were not luxury, they were tactical necessity. The galley was not comfort. It was fuel for human engines that had to run far longer than they were designed to operate. The primary mission was anti-submarine warfare, and in this role, the PBY proved devastatingly effective through a combination of endurance and tactics that Japanese submarine commanders had never anticipated. A typical patrol began with a sector assignment, often measuring hundreds of square miles of ocean. The search pattern varied by mission: box patterns, expanding squares, barrier patrols. The goal was coverage, ensuring every square mile received observation. Flying at 1,000 to 3,000 feet provided the best compromise between visibility and fuel economy. The patrol commander adjusted altitude based on weather, intelligence, and tactical situation. Lookouts scanned the ocean endlessly, searching for periscope wakes, oil slicks, debris, the telltale white wake of a surface submarine. The human eye remained the primary sensor. Radar, when available on later variants, helped, but had limitations. Surface search radars of 1943 could detect large ships at 20 miles, but struggled with small targets, like submarine conning towers. When a submarine was sighted, the window for attack was brutally short. A submarine could submerge in under 60 seconds. The ideal attack began with the submarine unaware, the aircraft approaching from astern or beam. The bombardier armed depth charges, setting them to detonate at 25 to 50 feet depth. The pilot descended to 50 feet above the water to minimize weapon dispersion. The release depended on speed, altitude, submarine maneuvers. Depth charges fell in a stick, spaced to straddle the submarine's probable position. When properly executed, underwater explosions created pressure waves that crushed pressure hulls, but submarines fought back with 20mm and 25mm anti-aircraft guns. Many Catalinas returned with battle damage. Some never returned at all. Between contacts, patrols were exercises in monotony. Hours passed with nothing visible but ocean and sky. Crews fought boredom, fatigue, the hypnotic effect of staring at endless water. They rotated watch, prepared meals, conducted maintenance, tried to sleep. The bunks saw constant use, men grabbing rest against the moment when action demanded peak performance. Then came the Black Cats. Beginning in late 1942, specialized Catalinas were painted matte black overall and sent hunting at night. Japanese submarines surfaced after dark to run diesel engines and recharge batteries. They believed darkness protected them. They were wrong. The Black Cat procedure began with radar contact at 8 to 12 miles. The pilot closed using radar guidance, maintaining 500 feet. The submarine, visible only as a dark shape against slightly lighter ocean, had no warning. The Catalina descended, lined up, released depth charges before the submarine crew knew an aircraft was present. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, these night attacks proved devastatingly effective. Japanese submarines found themselves hunted in darkness by aircraft they could neither see nor escape. The psychological impact was severe. Submarine crews became exhausted, unable to surface safely even at night. The toll was measured not just in submarines destroyed but in operational effectiveness. Strangled. Japanese boats spent excessive time submerged, consuming battery power, reducing range, achieving far less than their capability suggested. The PBY didn't have to sink every submarine, it just had to make the ocean unlivable for them, but the cost to the crews flying these missions was paid in increments of exhaustion that accumulated across 30 hours until every man aboard felt beaten by fatigue, so profound it became physical pain. After 20 hours airborne, even with sleep rotation, efficiency degraded markedly. Pilots made errors they would never commit when rested. Navigators miscalculated. Gunners failed to spot threats. The noise was relentless, the vibration continuous, the temperature extremes challenging. At altitude, temperatures dropped below freezing. At low level in the tropics, the interior exceeded 100 degrees. Men shivered through high-altitude portions, then sweated through low-level searches. The food situation, while better than most combat aircraft, remained far from adequate. After 20 hours, everything tasted like cardboard. Coffee became bitter and undrinkable. Fresh food spoiled. Men forced themselves to eat for calories, not enjoyment. The toilet created odours that permeated the aircraft. The lack of privacy was another indignity endured. Sleep in the bunks was fitful. The narrow cots offered little comfort. Engine noise and vibration made deep sleep nearly impossible. Men dozed, waking repeatedly, with aching bodies and minds that felt as exhausted as when they lay down. The psychological strain was perhaps worse than physical. Hours of staring at empty ocean induced hypnotic states where alertness degraded dangerously. Lookouts found themselves staring without seeing, minds wandering even as eyes pointed correctly. This trance-like state was dangerous. Submarines surfaced and dived within minutes. Inattention could miss the only opportunity for engagement. Fear was constant but suppressed. Engine failure over the Pacific meant ditching with uncertain rescue. Enemy fighters could appear without warning. Depth charges occasionally hung up or detonated prematurely. Men carried this fear silently because showing it undermined crew morale. Some men broke under the strain. Combat fatigue appeared among patrol plane crews. Men became unable to fly, developing mysterious ailments or suffering psychological crises. The Navy reassigned them to ground duties without stigma. The war needed experienced men even if they could no longer fly combat. The worst moments came when aircraft failed to return, when crews didn't report at expected times, when radio contact was lost and search aircraft found nothing. The Pacific swallowed men and machines without trace, yet they kept flying. Mission after mission, patrol after patrol, 20 hours, 25 hours, 30 hours. The longest documented operational flights were the Qantas Double Sunrise commercial services between Perth and Ceylon during 1943 to 1945, which regularly lasted 27 to 33 hours, with specially modified Catalinas carrying 1,188 gallons of fuel. 271 crossings, the longest commercial flights in aviation history by duration. Not military missions, but proof that with proper fuel management and crew endurance, a Catalina could remain airborne for longer than seemed humanly survivable. The impact of these patrols cannot be quantified simply. American patrol flying boats flew over 350,000 combat sorties during World War II. They destroyed over 40 enemy submarines. They rescued more than 4,000 downed aircrews and shipwreck survivors. They provided reconnaissance that shaped naval strategy. But numbers cannot capture what was accomplished. Every 31-hour patrol was a small war. Crews departed, not knowing if they would return. They faced mechanical failures that could end in ditching. They battled weather that could tear aircraft apart. They hunted enemies who fought back. And they did all this while managing human needs of food, rest, sanitation in a machine never designed for such extended habitation. The flying boat with bunks, galley, and toilet represented a philosophy of warfare that recognized human limitations and accommodated them. The designers who included crew facilities were not being soft. They were being practical. Men could not maintain combat effectiveness for 30 hours without basic provisions. This recognition, unusual in an era when military thinking often treated soldiers as expendable, created a weapon system more effective than specifications suggested. The PBY was not fast, not heavily armed, not glamorous, but it could stay on station longer than any other aircraft. And that endurance translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. August 15th, 1945, Kaneohe Bay. The sun was setting when the last patrol landed. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Crews who had flown together since 1943 climbed out in silence, having logged thousands of combat hours, survived engine failures, enemy fire, and more 30-hour patrols than anyone counted. Within months, most Catalinas would be scrapped or sold as surplus. The era of the long patrol was ending. Jet aircraft and advanced radar would make maritime surveillance faster. The need for crews to spend 31 hours aloft, living in their aircraft like sailors in a ship, would fade into history. But something profound had been proven, that human endurance could match mechanical endurance, that crews could function effectively across time spans military planners had considered impossible, that the longest battles could be fought not through speed or firepower, but through persistence. The crews maintained watch over vast reaches of ocean, protecting convoys, hunting submarines, rescuing the fallen. Every 31-hour patrol was an act of will, men pushing beyond breaking points because the mission demanded it. The statistics tell part of the story, but the real legacy was in what those crews proved. That maritime patrol could be sustained across previously impossible time periods. That aircraft could be designed not just as weapons but as environments where men could work and live for extended periods. That the longest missions of the war could be flown repeatedly by crews who returned, rested briefly, and went out again into the vast Pacific. The flying boats would rust or be scrapped. The bunks would rot. The galleys stripped for parts. The toilets, those remarkable symbols of American practicality, discarded. But the memory of what was accomplished would remain. They had been the silent guardians of the Pacific, crews who flew the longest missions of the war in aircraft equipped not for glory but for endurance. They had proven that sometimes victory comes not from striking the decisive blow, but from maintaining patient watch, from staying on station when staying seems impossible, from flying just one more hour when every hour before has pushed beyond human limits. The bunks, the galley, the toilet, they were not luxuries. They were tools of war as essential as guns and bombs. They enabled the mission. They made possible what doctrine said was impossible, and in that possibility lay a kind of victory all its own. The Japanese had believed the Pacific's vastness was their shield. The Americans built an aircraft that could turn vastness into a hunting ground, endurance into a weapon, and time itself into an advantage. The crews who flew those 31-hour missions didn't just fight the war, they redefined what fighting meant.